Hello everyone, tonight I'm taking you on a very special journey. Perhaps one of the most shocking family stories you'll ever hear. If this happened to you, you probably wouldn't survive it, couldn't handle it, would be broken by it. So please hit the like button and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy being here with me. And hey, drop in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I love knowing how far our little circle of light reaches. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some background noise, and let's begin tonight's journey. For 40 years, my children thought I was an ignorant villager. I never told them I studied at Oxford, that I conducted research there, that my articles were published in international journals. Because I was raised to be humble. But now that they looked down on me, it was time to reveal who I really was. That night I told them everything and made my final decision. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 68 years old, and I decided to tell this story because maybe other mothers have experienced similar things. Maybe you too are being looked down upon by your children. Maybe you too have never told anyone your true worth. This story is for them, for me, and for every mother who has sacrificed their identity for their children's happiness. It all started in 1955 in a small village called Millbrook in Yorkshire, England. My father, Reverend Jonathan Carter, was the village minister, a man of few words but deep convictions. My mother, Margaret, was a traditional housewife who had once dreamed of becoming a teacher herself but had given up those aspirations when she married at 18. Back then, it wasn't well received for girls to pursue higher education in our rural community. The prevailing wisdom was that girls should learn enough to manage a household and raise children, nothing more. Some families never sent their daughters beyond elementary school. What will a girl do with advanced education? She'll get married, keep house, and raise babies, they would say. But I was different from the start. I learned to read when I was just 5 years old, long before I ever set foot in a classroom. I had discovered my mother's old school books stored in the attic, dusty volumes of poetry, basic mathematics, and simple literature. While other children my age were playing with dolls, I was sitting in corners, sounding out words and trying to make sense of the magical symbols on the pages. When the village's only teacher, Mr. Richardson, noticed my unusual abilities during my first week of school, he was astounded. Here was a child who could already read at a level far beyond her years, who asked questions that showed a depth of thinking rare in adults. He immediately requested a meeting with my parents. Reverend Carter, Mr. Richardson said, sitting in our modest parlor, "This daughter of yours is extraordinarily gifted. She's sharp, incredibly intelligent, and has an insatiable curiosity about the world. You must provide her with the best education possible." My father's initial reaction was predictable. "Teacher, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but what practical purpose would advanced education serve for a girl? She'll grow up, marry a good man, keep his house, and raise his children." But my mother saw something in me that even I didn't understand yet. That evening, she spoke with my father in hushed tones. "Jonathan," she said, "there's something special about this child. When I look into her eyes, I see a hunger for knowledge that I've never seen before. Perhaps God has given her a gift that we're meant to nurture, not suppress." My father was a man of deep faith, and the suggestion that my intellectual gifts might be divinely inspired gave him pause. Over the following weeks, as reports of my academic achievements continued to pour in, my father began to soften his stance. I finished elementary school at the top of my class, but more than that, I had exhausted everything the village school could offer me. For middle school, I would need to travel to the market town of Harrogate. For high school, it would mean going even further, to the city of Leeds. Each transition sparked intense debates in our household. The village mayor, a progressive man named Mr. Whitmore, even weighed in on my behalf. "Reverend," he told my father, "this girl could be the pride of our village. Imagine, a girl from Millbrook making something extraordinary of herself." Gradually, my father's resistance crumbled. Perhaps it was my mother's gentle persistence, perhaps Mr. Richardson's passionate advocacy, or perhaps it was simply that he couldn't deny the evidence of my capabilities. High school in Leeds opened even more doors. The school was enormous, with hundreds of students and dozens of specialized teachers. I excelled in every subject, but I was particularly drawn to literature, history, and educational theory. My English literature teacher, Dr. Harrison, was a graduate of Cambridge University, and he recognized in me a quality of mind that he had rarely encountered. He began lending me books from his personal collection, works of literary criticism, philosophy, and educational theory. "Miss Carter," he told me during one of our discussions, "you have the kind of intellectual curiosity and analytical ability that belongs in a university. Have you given any thought to applying to Oxford or Cambridge?" The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. Oxford and Cambridge, the most prestigious universities in England, institutions that had educated prime ministers and Nobel Prize winners. Could a girl from a tiny Yorkshire village really belong in such company? Dr. Harrison spent countless hours helping me prepare my applications. When the acceptance letter from Oxford arrived in the spring of 1973, I could hardly believe it. Not only had I been accepted to read education at one of the world's most prestigious universities, but I had been awarded a full scholarship. The village response was mixed. Some neighbors celebrated this unprecedented achievement. Others worried that I was getting above myself, and that too much education would make me unmarriageable. The journey to Oxford in September 1973 was the most significant voyage of my life. As the train pulled into Oxford station and I caught my first glimpse of the famous spires, I felt as though I was entering a different world entirely. Oxford University was everything I had imagined and more. The medieval buildings, the ancient traditions, the sense of centuries of learning embedded in every stone, it was overwhelming and inspiring in equal measure. My college, St. Hilda's, was one of the few colleges that admitted women, and I was assigned to a small room overlooking a beautiful quad. My first year was challenging in ways I hadn't expected. Academically, I was well prepared. But socially, I felt the weight of my background. Many of my classmates came from wealthy families, had attended prestigious private schools, and spoke with accents that immediately marked them as members of Britain's upper classes. I spoke with a Yorkshire accent that I had never been self-conscious about before, but which now seemed to mark me as different. I learned to modulate my speech, to adopt the more refined tones of my educated classmates, though I never lost my authentic voice entirely. My tutors were extraordinary. Dr. Margaret Williams, who became my thesis supervisor, was a pioneering educational theorist who had written extensively about rural education. She took me under her wing from my first week at Oxford. "Miss Carter," she told me during one of our early tutorials, "you bring a perspective to these discussions that many of your classmates lack. You've experienced firsthand the kind of educational challenges we discuss in the abstract." The academic work was demanding but exhilarating. I was studying educational theory, psychology, literature, and research methodology. I was particularly fascinated by rural education, how to provide quality learning opportunities to students in isolated communities. For my second-year research project, I chose to study educational opportunities in rural Yorkshire communities, drawing on my own background. I traveled back to villages throughout the region, interviewing teachers, students, and parents. The research opened my eyes to patterns I had experienced but never fully understood. By my third year, I had found my intellectual footing. I was thriving academically, had made close friendships, and had begun to develop a clear vision for my future. I wanted to return to rural communities to teach, but armed with the knowledge and insights I was gaining at Oxford. My final thesis was titled Educational Equity in Rural Britain: Barriers, Opportunities, and Innovative Solutions. It was an extensive study that combined theoretical frameworks with original research from rural communities across northern England. Dr. Williams was enthusiastic about the work. "This is exactly the kind of research that could influence policy," she told me. "You should seriously consider staying on for graduate study." But I had always planned to return home after graduation. When I graduated in 1976 with first-class honors, I had several options. Dr. Williams had offered to support my application for graduate study. I had received inquiries from educational publishers. I had even been approached about opportunities in London's education ministry. Instead, I chose to return to Yorkshire to teach. "I want to bring what I've learned home," I explained. "This is where I belong, and this is where I can make the most difference." I took a position teaching at a comprehensive school in a small industrial town. The school served a working-class community where many parents had left school at 14 and were skeptical about the value of extended education. My colleagues were initially puzzled by my presence. "Why are you here?" the headmaster asked me during my first week. "Because this is where I'm needed," I replied simply. I threw myself into teaching with all the passion and knowledge I had gained at Oxford. I developed innovative approaches to engage students who had been told they weren't academic material. I created reading programs that connected literature to students' own experiences. The results were encouraging. Students who had been written off as slow began to flourish. Several of my students went on to university, some the first in their families ever to do so. It was during my second year of teaching that I met Michael Thompson. He was a teacher at a neighboring school, a man from a working-class background who had also earned a university degree and chosen to return to serve his community. We met at a regional education conference where I was presenting my ideas about innovative approaches to rural education. Michael was in the audience, and after my presentation, he approached me with thoughtful questions and insightful observations. We began corresponding about educational theory and practice, sharing ideas and strategies. Our professional relationship gradually deepened into friendship, and friendship blossomed into love. When we married in 1978, it was a celebration that brought together the farming families who had known me since childhood with the university friends who had become part of my adult life. Dr. Williams attended the wedding, as did several of my Oxford classmates. Michael and I settled in a small cottage between our respective schools. We both continued teaching, spending our evenings and weekends collaborating on educational projects, reading and discussing new developments in the field. In 1980, our son Henry was born. As I held him for the first time, I thought about all the research I had done on early childhood development. I was determined to provide him with every opportunity while ensuring he remained grounded in the values that had shaped me. 2 years later, our daughter Sarah joined our family. Michael and I threw ourselves into parenthood with the same thoughtfulness we brought to our teaching. From the beginning, I was determined that my children would know the value of education, but I also wanted them to appreciate the dignity of all forms of honest work. I read to them constantly, surrounded them with books, and engaged them in conversations that stretched their thinking. But I was also careful not to put pressure on them or suggest that their worth was tied to academic achievements. I had seen too many children from educated families who felt crushed by unrealistic expectations. As Henry and Sarah grew, they both showed signs of intellectual curiosity and academic ability. Henry was particularly drawn to mathematics and science, while Sarah gravitated toward literature and history. I was proud of their achievements, but I was equally proud when they showed kindness to struggling classmates. Throughout their childhood, I never spoke about my Oxford background. This decision was deliberate and, I believed, important. I wanted my children to respect me because I was their mother, because I loved them unconditionally, and because I tried every day to be worthy of that respect. Michael supported this decision completely. "Let them know you for who you are," he would say, "not for what you've accomplished." There were certainly moments when this choice was difficult. When Henry struggled with advanced mathematics, I could have told him that I had studied similar topics at Oxford. Instead, I found other ways to support his learning without revealing my background. As they grew older, my children sometimes made comments that stung. Henry, influenced by his science teachers, began to suggest that people from rural backgrounds were somehow less sophisticated. "Mum," he said when he was about 16, "you and Dad are fine for small-town people, but you don't really understand how the world works now. Technology is changing everything, and you've been stuck in the same place your whole lives." The irony was painful. I had been part of cutting-edge educational research at one of the world's leading universities. But my son saw only a small-town teacher who had never left her childhood community. Sarah developed similar attitudes as she progressed through her education. She was bright and academically successful, and she began to view her rural upbringing as something to be transcended. "I can't wait to get away from here," she would say. "I want to live somewhere sophisticated, where people understand culture and ideas." These comments were like knives to my heart, but I tried to understand them as part of normal adolescent development. I hoped that as Henry and Sarah matured, they would come to appreciate their upbringing. Unfortunately, Their attitudes only became more entrenched as they left home for university. Henry studied medicine at Edinburgh, while Sarah read law at London School of Economics. Both excelled academically, and I was genuinely proud. But their success seemed to increase their sense of superiority over their parents. When they came home for holidays, they would speak about their studies in ways that implicitly dismissed the intelligence of anyone who hadn't shared their experiences. They seemed to view Michael and me as loving but limited people. Henry, after qualifying as a doctor, was particularly condescending. "Mum," he would say, "medicine is incredibly complex now. It's not something people without scientific training can really comprehend." I would nod and smile, even though I had studied research methodology at Oxford and had published articles about educational psychology that drew on scientific principles. Sarah, after beginning her legal career, adopted a similar tone. "Mum, the law is incredibly intricate," she would explain. "It requires years of specialized training to understand how legal principles interact with social policy." Again, I would simply nod, even though I had studied education law at Oxford and had worked with solicitors on various policy issues throughout my career. The most painful aspect wasn't the condescension itself, but the complete lack of curiosity they showed about my life and experiences. They never asked about my thoughts on complex issues, never sought my advice on professional challenges, never wondered whether I might have insights worth considering. This became more complicated when Henry married Patricia, a woman from a wealthy London family who considered herself very sophisticated. Patricia was polite to me, but in a way that made clear she viewed me as a simple country woman. "It's lovely that you've stayed in the same village all your life," she would say with a condescending smile. "Some people are just more comfortable with familiar surroundings." Henry never challenged these comments. If anything, he seemed to agree with Patricia's assessment. Sarah's marriage to James, a fellow lawyer, brought similar dynamics. James was more subtle in his condescension, but the message was the same. He viewed me as a well-meaning but intellectually limited woman. The most painful moment came during one family gathering when Patricia was describing her own mother's accomplishments, her charity work, her social connections. "Of course," Patricia said, glancing at me with feigned sympathy, "not everyone has had the same opportunities. Emily did the best she could with her limited education and rural background." I watched my children nod along with this assessment, apparently comfortable with Patricia's characterization of their mother as someone who had done her best despite significant limitations. The crisis came in 2018, when Michael suffered a sudden heart attack and died. We had been married for 40 years, and he had been my closest friend, my intellectual companion, and my strongest supporter throughout all the years of hiding my background. Losing Michael was devastating in every way. But perhaps most painfully, I had lost the person who had helped me maintain perspective during all the years when our children's condescension had hurt so deeply. In my grief, I needed my children's support more than ever. But instead of offering comfort, Henry and Sarah seemed to view Michael's death as an opportunity to take control of my life in ways that were both patronizing and painful. "Mum," Henry said during one conversation about funeral arrangements, "you're probably not thinking clearly right now. Why don't you let Patricia and me handle all the practical details?" "Yes," Sarah agreed, "these kinds of arrangements can be very complex. It's not the sort of thing you should have to worry about." I understood that they meant well, but their assumption that I was incapable of handling complex arrangements was both hurtful and insulting. I had been managing household finances, dealing with bureaucracy, and handling complex logistics throughout my adult life. The situation became even more painful when the time came to deal with Michael's will and our financial affairs. Michael and I had been careful financial planners throughout our marriage. We had invested wisely and built up a comfortable retirement fund. But when Henry and Sarah learned the details of our financial situation, their response was to assume that I couldn't possibly manage these resources on my own. "Mum," Sarah said, "this is actually quite a substantial amount of money. You'll need professional advice about investments, tax implications, estate planning." "I think you should consider moving closer to one of us," Henry added. "Living alone in a rural area when you're managing significant financial resources isn't really safe." The breaking point came several months after Michael's funeral, when Henry and Sarah arranged a family meeting to discuss my future. They had clearly coordinated their approach and presented me with what they considered a reasonable plan. "We've been thinking," Sarah began, "that it might be time for you to consider some changes in your living situation. The cottage is quite isolated," Henry added, "and as you get older, you'll need more support." "We've looked into some very nice assisted living facilities," Patricia chimed in. "Places where you'd have social activities, professional care, and people to help with daily tasks." "Of course," Sarah continued, "we'd help you manage the transition. We could handle selling the cottage, dealing with your possessions, managing your finances." They presented this as though they were offering me wonderful gifts. But what I heard was a proposal to strip away my independence, my home, my autonomy, and my dignity. "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully, "but I'm perfectly capable of living independently." "Mum," Henry said with the patient tone one might use with a confused child, "you're 70 years old. These aren't decisions you should be making on your own." It was in that moment that I realized how completely my children had misjudged me and how thoroughly I had failed to help them understand who I really was. They saw me as an elderly woman whose capabilities were declining, whose judgment couldn't be trusted. They had no idea that I had spent years conducting independent research, publishing academic articles, managing complex projects, and making decisions that had influenced educational policy. They didn't know that I had been handling our family's financial planning for decades. That night, I sat alone in the cottage, surrounded by books, papers, and mementos of a rich intellectual life that my children had never bothered to explore. I looked at the box in my closet that contained my Oxford diploma, my published articles, letters from colleagues, and awards for my educational work. For 4 decades, I had kept this part of my life hidden, believing that my children's love should be based on who I was as a person rather than on academic achievements. But now I realized that my silence had contributed to a fundamental misunderstanding about my capabilities. The decision was made for me when Sarah called to say that she had scheduled appointments for me to visit assisted living facilities. "We'll pick you up Saturday morning," she announced. "I'm not visiting assisted living facilities," I told her firmly. "I'm perfectly capable of living independently." "Mum," she said with exaggerated patience, "you're not thinking clearly about this. You can't live alone indefinitely." "My thinking is perfectly clear," I replied. "Clearer than it's been in years." It was in that moment that I decided the time had come to tell them the truth. "I'd like you both to come over this weekend," I said calmly. "There are some things about my background that I think you should know before you make any more assumptions about my capabilities." That Saturday afternoon, Henry and Sarah arrived with Patricia and James. They clearly expected a difficult conversation about my resistance to their plans. And they had brought reinforcements. I had spent the morning preparing. From the box in my closet, I had retrieved my Oxford diploma, my published articles, letters from colleagues, conference programs, and photographs from my university years. I had also gathered financial documents showing my successful management of our family's resources. We sat in the living room where Michael and I had entertained friends and discussed educational theory. The walls were lined with serious works on education, psychology, and literature. I wondered how my children had managed to spend so many years in this house without ever being curious about the intellectual life that surrounded them. "I asked you here," I began, "because I think there are some things you need to know about my background before we continue discussing my future." "Mum," Henry said condescendingly, "we understand that you've had a good life here. We just think you need to be realistic about what's practical at your age." "Let me finish," I said firmly. "For 40 years, I've kept something from you. I made a deliberate choice when you were children not to tell you about my educational background, because I wanted your respect and love to be based on who I was as your mother, not on external achievements." I paused, looking at each of their faces. They were clearly puzzled. "However," I continued, "your recent assumptions about my capabilities are based on fundamental misconceptions about who I am. So I think it's time you learned the truth." I reached for the box on the coffee table and slowly opened it. The first item I withdrew was my Oxford diploma. "This," I said, unfolding the document carefully, "is my Master of Arts degree in Education from Oxford University, awarded in 1976 with first-class honors. The silence that followed was profound. Henry's mouth fell open. Sarah stared at the diploma as though it were written in a foreign language. Patricia and James exchanged glances of complete bewilderment. That's not possible," Henry finally stammered. "You never went to university." "I went to Oxford on a full scholarship," I replied calmly. "I studied there for 3 years, conducted original research, and graduated at the top of my class. After graduation, I chose to return here to teach." Sarah was shaking her head in disbelief. "But you never told us." "I made a conscious decision not to tell you," I explained. "I wanted you to respect me because I was your mother, not because I had a degree from a prestigious university." I reached into the box again and withdrew my published articles. "These are research papers I wrote during and after my time at Oxford. They were published in peer-reviewed academic journals and are still cited by researchers today." Henry picked up one of the articles with trembling hands. "Educational Equity in Rural Communities," he read aloud. "Published in the International Journal of Educational Research, 1977. Author, Emily M. Carter." "You wrote this?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wrote all of them," I confirmed. "During my career, I published 17 research articles, presented papers at 12 international conferences, and served as a consultant to the Department of Education." Patricia was studying one of the conference programs. "Keynote speaker, Dr. Emily Carter. Oxford University," she read. "I was awarded an honorary doctorate by Leeds University in 1995, I explained. "But I've never used the title in everyday life." The room was completely silent except for the sound of pages turning as my children examined the evidence of a life they had never known existed. Henry looked up from the article he was reading. "Mum, this research is sophisticated. It's university-level academic work." "It is university-level work," I replied. "I conducted it while serving as an unofficial research fellow at Oxford." Sarah was looking at a letter from the Department of Education. "They were asking for your input on national policy?" she asked incredulously. "Rural education was my specialty," I said. "The work I did here became a model for similar programs across the country." "But," Henry said, clearly struggling to process this information, "why didn't you ever tell us?" "Let you think what?" I asked gently. He flushed red. "Let us think you were just a simple village teacher who didn't understand complex issues." The weight of his words hung in the air. Patricia looked mortified. James was studying his hands. "I let you think that," I said quietly, "because I hoped that regardless of my educational background, you would come to respect me as your mother and as a person." Sarah began to cry. "Oh, Mum, we've been so awful to you." "We had no idea," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. "We thought we were so much more sophisticated than you." I looked at each of them in turn. "Education isn't about having degrees," I said. "Real education is about wisdom, compassion, humility, and the ability to keep learning throughout your life." "But you did," Sarah said. "You accomplished all of this. And we never knew." That was perhaps the most painful part. For 40 years, my children had lived surrounded by evidence of intellectual engagement. But they had never been curious enough about me to ask about my background. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" Henry asked again. "Because I still hoped you would come to respect me for who I was. Not for what I had achieved," I replied. "But more than that, I was beginning to realize that you needed to learn some lessons about humility." James finally looked up. "Mrs. Carter," he said formally, "I owe you an enormous apology." "We all do," Patricia added. "I feel sick thinking about some of the things I've said to you." I reached into the box one more time and withdrew my financial records. "Since you've been concerned about my ability to manage complex financial matters," I said, "you might be interested to know that I've been handling our family's investments and estate planning for 30 years. Henry examined the documents with growing amazement. These returns, these investment strategies, they're extremely sophisticated. I've been managing a portfolio worth over £400,000 for the past 15 years, I said calmly. Sarah was crying harder now. We wanted to put you in assisted living, she sobbed. We thought you were losing your capabilities. The irony, I said gently, is that if you had asked me about my background at any point in the past 20 years, I would have told you. I kept it secret when you were children, but once you were adults, I was simply waiting for you to show enough interest in me to ask. The conversation that followed lasted several hours. My children asked me to tell them about Oxford, about my research, about the policy work I had done. They wanted to understand how I had managed to keep such a significant part of my life hidden. I told them about the scholarship that had made Oxford possible, about the professors who had mentored me, about the choice I had made to return to rural Yorkshire rather than pursue a conventional academic career. But didn't you ever regret it? Sarah asked. Never, I replied honestly. I accomplished more in rural Yorkshire than I ever could have in a university. I helped transform educational opportunities for children throughout this region. And most importantly, I raised 2 children who have become accomplished, caring adults. Henry was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, Mum, when we suggested assisted living, were you angry? I considered the question carefully. I was hurt, I said finally. Not angry, but deeply hurt. You were making decisions about my life based on assumptions that were completely wrong. We didn't, Sarah admitted. We never took the time to really know you. Over the following weeks, my relationship with my children underwent a complete transformation. They began calling regularly, not to check up on me but to ask my opinions on complex issues they were dealing with professionally. Henry found himself consulting me about ethical dilemmas in his medical practice. You ask different questions, he told me. You help me see the human side of medical decisions. Sarah began asking me about education law cases. Your background gives you insights that other lawyers don't possess, she said. But perhaps more importantly, they began asking me about my life, my experiences, my thoughts on everything from literature to politics. For the first time in decades, they seemed genuinely curious about me as a person. The change in Patricia and James was even more dramatic. Patricia began asking me about community development work. I work with charity organizations in London, she told me, and we struggle with some of the same issues you were addressing. James began sending me legal articles and asking for my analysis. Your perspective is invaluable, he said. The most meaningful change was in how they treated me during family gatherings. Instead of talking around me, they began including me in conversations as an intellectual equal. During one dinner conversation about education policy, instead of assuming I wouldn't understand, they turned to me for analysis. Mum, Henry said, you've been working on education policy for 40 years. What do you think are the most important changes needed? I found myself in a detailed discussion about resource allocation, teacher training, and assessment strategies. My children listened intently and treated my expertise with respect. This is how it should have been all along, Sarah said after that conversation. The revelation also led to unexpected opportunities. Word of my research began to spread through their professional networks, and I started receiving invitations to speak at conferences and contribute to policy discussions. Dr. Williams, my former supervisor at Oxford, invited me to co-author an article about rural education initiatives. Emily, she said, your work over the past 40 years represents one of the most comprehensive studies ever conducted. You need to document this. 6 months after the revelation, Henry and Sarah organized a celebration to honor my contributions to education. They invited colleagues, former students, and community members who had been touched by my work. The evening was overwhelming. Former students spoke about how I had encouraged them to pursue higher education. Colleagues described innovative programs we had developed. Community leaders talked about the lasting impact of our partnerships between schools and local organizations. But the most meaningful moment came when Henry stood up to speak. I want to apologize publicly, he said, for the years I spent failing to recognize the remarkable woman who raised me. My mother taught me to value education, to work hard, and to treat all people with dignity. But somehow I failed to apply those lessons to understanding and appreciating her. He paused, clearly emotional. For 40 years, she kept her extraordinary achievements secret because she wanted my sister and me to love and respect her for who she was as our mother. The tragedy is that we failed to show her the respect she deserved even when we thought she was just a village teacher. Sarah spoke next. "What I've learned," she said, "is that my mother was teaching us about the most important lesson in education, that every person has value and dignity that deserve recognition. I'm ashamed that it took me so long to apply that lesson to my relationship with her." A year after revealing my Oxford background, I received an invitation that brought my career full circle. Oxford University was hosting a conference on rural education, and they wanted me to deliver the keynote address on 4 decades of innovation in rural educational policy. Henry and Sarah both wanted to attend. "We'd like to see you in your professional element," Henry said. "We'd like to understand this part of your life that we never knew existed." The conference was held in the same college where I had lived as a student. Walking through the familiar quads, I was overwhelmed by memories of my younger self and the dreams I had pursued. My keynote address traced the evolution of rural education policy over 4 decades. I described the programs we had developed, the policy changes we had influenced, and the lessons we had learned. Real educational change, I concluded, doesn't happen in university lecture halls. It happens in classrooms, in communities, in the everyday interactions between teachers and students. My years in rural Yorkshire taught me that the most profound research is conducted not in laboratories but in the lived experience of learning and teaching. The response was overwhelmingly positive. During the reception, Dr. Williams approached me with tears in her eyes. "Emily," she said, "that was exactly the kind of impact I hoped you would have. You've proven that the best academic work comes from deep engagement with real-world problems." Henry and Sarah were visibly moved by the respect shown to me by the international academic community. During our train ride back to Yorkshire, Sarah reflected on what she had observed. "Mum," she said, "watching you at that conference, I finally understand what we missed all these years. We saw you as our local teacher mother, but you're actually a major figure in your field." "What struck me most," Henry added, "was how you talked about your work. You weren't boasting. You were sharing knowledge because you genuinely wanted to help people." I appreciated their observations, but I also wanted them to understand that the respect I had received at the conference wasn't more important than the respect I deserved as their mother. "The lesson here," I said gently, "isn't that you should have respected me more because I'm accomplished professionally. The lesson is that every person deserves respect and curiosity, regardless of their apparent status." They both nodded, understanding the deeper point. That evening, as I sat in the cottage that Michael and I had shared, I opened the box that had contained my Oxford diploma. For 40 years, these documents had been hidden away, part of a secret identity. Now they represented not secrets but simply one aspect of a complex life that included many roles: student, researcher, teacher, wife, mother, community member. My children now knew about all these roles. I thought about Michael and how pleased he would be to know that our children finally understood the full scope of my life and work. He had always believed that the truth would emerge when the time was right. Looking back over the past year, I realized that the revelation had been transformative not just for my relationship with my children, but for my own sense of identity. For decades, I had defined myself primarily as a mother and teacher, keeping my research work as secondary. Now, in my 70s, I was finally integrating all aspects of my life and receiving recognition for the full scope of my contributions. But more importantly, I was truly known and appreciated by my own children. The experience had taught me that identity is complex and multifaceted, and that relationships are enriched when we can be fully known for all aspects of who we are. Hiding part of myself had been motivated by love, but it had ultimately limited the depth of my relationships with the people I cared about most. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt a deep sense of peace. The secrets were gone, the misunderstandings had been cleared up, and my children now knew me as a complete person. The girl who had learned to read in a Yorkshire village attic had become a woman who had influenced educational policy across the nation. The student who had walked through Oxford's gates with wonder had become a scholar whose work was still being cited. The young mother who had chosen to keep her achievements secret had become an elderly woman whose children finally understood the full richness of her life. It had been a long journey, marked by difficult choices and painful misunderstandings. But in the end, truth had prevailed, love had deepened, and the relationships that mattered most had been strengthened by honesty and understanding. As I turned off the lights and settled into the bed I had shared with Michael for so many years, I whispered a quiet thank you to the teachers who had believed in a village girl's potential, to the university that had given me opportunities one had never dared dream of, to the students and communities that had allowed me to put my knowledge into practice, and to the children who had finally learned to see their mother as a complete and complex human being. The journey had been long and sometimes difficult, but it had led to this moment of complete integration and authentic relationship. And that, I realized as sleep finally came, was worth all the years of hidden achievements and patient waiting. The truth, as Michael had always believed, had emerged when the time was right. And now that it was finally revealed, our family was stronger, more honest, and more deeply connected than it had ever been before. But the story doesn't end there. In the months that followed, I found myself busier than I had been in decades. The academic community had rediscovered me, and suddenly I was receiving invitations from around the world. Universities wanted me to speak about rural education policy. Research institutes asked me to contribute to studies on educational equity. Government departments sought my input on new initiatives. My children watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and amazement. "Mum," Sarah said during one of our weekly phone calls, "I just read that you're advising the European Union on rural education standards. That's incredible." "It's just consulting work," I replied modestly. "The same kind of thing I've been doing for years, just with a wider audience." "But don't you see?" Henry interjected. He was on speakerphone from his office. "You've been operating at this level for decades, and we never knew. We thought you were just our village teacher, Mum, but you're actually an internationally recognized expert." The irony wasn't lost on me. For 40 years, I had deliberately downplayed my achievements to focus on being their mother. Now, in my 70s, I was finally receiving the professional recognition that my work had always deserved, largely because my children had inadvertently publicized my background through their own professional networks. Henry had mentioned my Oxford credentials to colleagues at the hospital, several of whom turned out to be familiar with my published research. Sarah had done the same at her law firm, where partners were impressed to learn that she was the daughter of Dr. Emily Carter, whose work on education law they had studied in university. "It's funny," Patricia said during one family dinner, "I used to work for a charity that implemented programs based on your research. I had no idea I was married to the son of the woman who developed the theoretical framework we were using." The revelation had also opened doors I hadn't expected. Oxford invited me to return as a visiting fellow for a semester, giving me access to resources and colleagues I hadn't worked with in decades. The invitation came with a beautiful letter from the current head of the education department. "Dr. Carter, your pioneering work on rural education has influenced generations of researchers and practitioners. We would be honored to welcome you back to Oxford, where your journey in this field began. Your practical experience implementing the theories you developed here would be invaluable to our current students." I accepted the fellowship, partly because it represented a wonderful full-circle moment, but mostly because I was excited about the opportunity to mentor young researchers who were passionate about educational equity. Sarah and Henry both visited me during my time at Oxford. Watching them walk through the same quads where I had studied as a young woman, seeing them meet my former professors and current colleagues, was deeply moving. "This is where it all started," I told them as we stood in the Bodleian Library, surrounded by the same ancient books I had pored over decades earlier. "This is where I learned to think critically about education, to ask difficult questions, to believe that research could make a real difference in people's lives." Henry was particularly fascinated by the laboratory where I had conducted some of my psychological research on learning processes. "Mum," he said, "the methodology you developed here is more sophisticated than what we use in some of our medical research. I had no idea that educational psychology was so rigorous." During my time at Oxford, I also had the opportunity to reconnect with former classmates who had pursued more traditional academic careers. At a reunion dinner, I sat next to Professor James Wellington, who now held the chair in educational policy at Cambridge. "Emily," he said, "I've been following your work for years. What you accomplished in Yorkshire was extraordinary. You took the theories we all studied and actually made them work in the real world. That's much harder than what most of us did, staying in universities and writing papers about practice rather than engaging in it." His words meant more to me than he could have known. For decades, I had sometimes wondered whether I had made the right choice in returning to rural teaching rather than pursuing a traditional academic career. But now I understood that my path had been not just valid but valuable in ways that a purely academic career could never have been. The semester at Oxford also gave me the opportunity to work with current doctoral students who were researching issues similar to those I had tackled decades earlier. I was struck by how much the field had evolved, but also by how many of the fundamental challenges remained the same. Dr. Carter, one young researcher, told me after a seminar where I had presented my work, "Your longitudinal studies from Yorkshire are still the gold standard in our field. No one else has managed to track educational outcomes over such an extended period while maintaining such detailed qualitative data." I realized that what I had seen simply as doing my job, staying in one community, building relationships, tracking student progress over time, had actually created a unique research opportunity that would be almost impossible to replicate in today's more mobile academic environment. When my fellowship ended and I returned to Yorkshire, I brought with me not just renewed energy for my work, but also a deeper appreciation for the choices I had made throughout my career. I had not sacrificed academic rigor for practical application. I had found a way to combine both in a manner that had ultimately proved more valuable than either approach alone. My children seemed to understand this too. "Mum," Sarah said during one of our conversations, "I used to think you had wasted your Oxford education by coming back to teach in a village school. Now I realize that you found a way to apply your education that was more meaningful than anything you could have done staying in academia." Henry nodded in agreement. "You didn't just study educational theory, you lived it, tested it, refined it through decades of practice. That's why your work has had such lasting impact." Their newfound understanding of my career path also seemed to influence their own professional choices. Henry began volunteering at a free clinic in an underserved area, applying his medical expertise where it was most needed rather than focusing solely on lucrative private practice. Sarah started taking on more pro bono cases involving educational rights, particularly for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. "You taught us," Sarah explained, "that real expertise comes from combining knowledge with service, from using what you know to make a difference in the world rather than just advancing your own career." The transformation in our family relationships continued to deepen over time. What had begun as shock and embarrassment over their treatment of me gradually evolved into genuine curiosity about my perspectives and experiences. They began seeking my advice not just on professional matters, but on personal challenges as well. When Henry and Patricia faced difficulties in their marriage, Henry called me for guidance. "Mum," he said, "you and Dad had such a strong partnership. How did you manage to support each other's goals while also building a life together?" It was a conversation we could never have had when he still saw me as a simple village wife who had never faced complex challenges. Now that he understood the choices Michael and I had made, my decision to keep my background secret, his support for that choice, our collaboration on educational projects, he could appreciate the sophistication of our relationship. Similarly, when Sarah struggled with work-life balance as her legal career became more demanding, she turned to me for advice about managing professional ambition with personal fulfillment. "You managed to have a significant impact in your field while also being present for us as children," she said. "How did you balance those competing demands?" These conversations allowed me to share not just practical advice, but also the deeper wisdom I had gained through decades of navigating complex choices. I could talk about the importance of staying true to your values even when external pressures suggest different paths, about finding ways to integrate different aspects of your identity rather than compartmentalizing them, about the long-term satisfaction that comes from work that serves others rather than just advancing your own status. The ripple effects of these changed relationships extended beyond our immediate family. My grandchildren, Henry's son Edward and Sarah's daughter Emma, began to see me differently as well. Instead of just grandmum who lives in the country, I became grandmum who studied at Oxford and helped change education policy. But more importantly, they began to understand that these different aspects of my identity were all connected, that my love for them, my commitment to education, my research work, and my rural values were all part of the same whole. Edward, now 16 and considering university options, sought my advice about his future plans. "Grandmum," he said during one visit, "I'm interested in medicine like Dad, but I also care about social justice. How do you combine professional success with making a real difference?" I was touched that he would ask me such a serious question, and I tried to give him an answer that honored both the complexity of the choice and his own developing values. "The most important thing," I told him, "is to remember that success isn't just about what you achieve for yourself, it's about what you contribute to the world. Your father is learning this too. He's discovering that his medical skills can be used not just to build a successful practice, but to serve people who really need help." Emma, slightly younger but equally thoughtful, was interested in my research on gender equity in education. "Grandmum," she said, "when you were at Oxford, were there many women studying there?" Her question led to a long conversation about the challenges and opportunities one had faced as a woman in higher education during the 1970s, about how much had changed since then, and about the work that still needed to be done to ensure equal opportunities for all students. These conversations with my grandchildren felt particularly meaningful because they represented the true continuation of my legacy. Not just the research I had published or the policies I had influenced, but the values and perspectives I could pass on to the next generation. As I reflected on the years since revealing my Oxford background, I realized that the experience had taught me important lessons about identity, family relationships, and the nature of respect. I had learned that hiding significant aspects of yourself, even with the best intentions, can create barriers to authentic relationship. While my desire to be loved for who I was rather than what I had achieved was understandable, my silence had contributed to my children's development of attitudes that ultimately hurt our relationship. I had also learned that respect is earned not just through love and consistency, but through allowing others to see and appreciate your full complexity as a human being. My children couldn't truly respect me until they truly knew me, and I had prevented that knowledge by keeping such a significant part of my life secret. But perhaps most importantly, I had learned that it's never too late to change the dynamics of family relationships. Even though my children were well into their adult lives when they learned the truth about my background, they were still capable of growth, of recognizing their mistakes, and of developing new and deeper appreciation for their mother. The experience had also reinforced my belief in the importance of approaching all people with curiosity and humility. Every person we encounter has a story that is richer and more complex than it appears on the surface. The elderly woman in the grocery store might be a retired professor. The quiet man at the coffee shop might be a published poet. The unassuming teacher at the local school might be an internationally recognized researcher. My story had become a powerful example for my children and their friends of why it's important to treat all people with respect and to remain curious about their experiences and perspectives. Henry often told colleagues about how his assumptions about his mother had been so completely wrong, using it as a reminder to approach patients with greater humility and openness. Sarah incorporated the lessons from our family experience into her legal practice, taking more time to really understand her clients' backgrounds and perspectives rather than making assumptions based on their apparent education or social status. Now, at 75, I find myself in a position I never expected to be in. I am simultaneously a respected academic whose work is cited internationally, a grandmother who bakes cookies and tells stories, a consultant who advises government ministries, and a village resident who knows everyone's name and remembers their family histories. All of these roles feel authentic and integrated in a way they never did when I was hiding parts of my identity. I no longer feel the need to downplay my achievements or to worry that professional recognition might somehow diminish my relationships with family and community. My children now understand that my love for them was never conditional on hiding my accomplishments. It was simply love, pure and simple. And their love for me has deepened now that they know and appreciate the full complexity of who I am. The cottage that Michael and I shared is now filled with evidence of all aspects of my life: family photos alongside academic awards, children's drawings next to research publications, rural community newsletters beside international conference programs. It feels like a complete and honest representation of a life lived fully and authentically. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I think about the young woman who left Oxford in 1976 with such high hopes for making a difference in the world. She could never have imagined the path that lay ahead, the decades of patient work in rural communities, the slow building of programs and relationships, the choice to hide her credentials in order to focus on being a mother, and finally, the late-in-life recognition and integration of all aspects of her identity. But I think she would be proud of how it all turned out. She wanted to use her education to make a real difference in the world, and that's exactly what happened. She wanted to be a good mother, and despite the temporary misunderstandings, that happened too. She wanted to contribute to knowledge and policy in ways that would help children from backgrounds like her own, and the evidence suggests she succeeded. Most importantly, she wanted to live a life guided by love, integrity, and service to others. And looking back over nearly 8 decades, I can say with confidence that I have done exactly that. The journey from that Yorkshire village to Oxford and back again, from hidden achievements to public recognition, from misunderstood mother to respected matriarch, has been long and sometimes difficult. But it has also been rich, meaningful, and ultimately profoundly satisfying. And the best part is that it's not over yet. There are still students to mentor, policies to influence, grandchildren to guide, and communities to serve. There are still opportunities to learn, to grow, and to contribute. The girl who learned to read in a village attic became a woman who helped shape educational opportunities for thousands of children. The student who walked nervously through Oxford's gates became a scholar whose work continues to influence researchers decades later. The mother who hid her achievements to focus on her children became a grandmother whose full story now serves as an inspiration to the next generation. It has been, by any measure, a life well lived. And the most beautiful part is that my children now understand that too.